All right, welcome to another midweek podcast for the Freeborn podcast. Today, I was looking at an article in Yahoo News written by an obvious critic of the Trump administration, so we should always take that into account. That doesn't mean that what they're saying is untrue or that it is untrustworthy, but that is necessary to take into account. So, in this article, he is reporting on what is an apparent conflict of interest of the president as he touts the return of businesses and the reopening of businesses after after the lockdown. And it was attached, the president's tweet on this was attached to a tweet or to a message sent from one of his golf clubs, also advertising that reopening. And of course, that presents a certain conflict of interest that is difficult to ignore. Anyways, I want to talk a little more about this, but in more of an abstract or general way, not just not this issue specifically, but a general or abstract view of what this means. So there is what appears to me to be a moral upending or reversal of fortune between the Republican Party and the Democrat Party. There's a very, it seems to me to be a very interesting conundrum or a very interesting situation that has arisen. And in a way, we could look at the presidency of Donald Trump as a tremendous gift to the Republican Party, and not because he won when it didn't seem like was going to be possible to many people, but not because he won or not because of the outcome of the election itself, but the Republican Party has had a struggle since the late 70s. So in the late 70s, Jerry Falwell creates the moral majority that holds a tremendous amount of power and sway in Republican politics all the way up through the mid 80s to the end of the 80s. By the end of the 80s, their power had waned to the point where they disbanded. But that movement introduced into the Republican Party a certain commitment, I think an unwilling commitment, and in some cases an unwitting commitment, to individual moral values amongst Republican politicians, not just collective ones. Now, to you and I, who associate the collective with the individual when it comes to morality, that seems obvious, which is the point and the problem, if you will. At least the problem from a political perspective. So Republicans and Christians and conservative Christians have long bemoaned the fact that it appears that Democrats can live in an individual sense any way they want, and there seems to be no repercussions to it. So they can go on the media, they can get on their bully pulpit and lecture people about all the moral shortcomings they see in the world, and then go out and do the same thing. So we see this in the climate control debate, where they'll all jet in on their private planes to a conference where they're going to lecture us for leaving our lights on while we're gone at night. Or we see it in the Me Too movement type thing, where they're going to lecture the country on how they treat women, and yet come to find out many of them aren't any better. In fact, many of them are even worse. And so it has been to the dismay and to the consternation of conservative Christians and Republicans that Republican politicians are held apparently to seemingly to a different standard than Democrat politicians seem to be. And so excuse me. And so what we have here is, like I say, in the late 70s, the 80s, the moral majority comes in, takes over conservative politics, and it becomes a moral conservative party. Well, that is done by people who are not only advocating a collective morality or a secular morality, but a strongly religious morality coming from a conservative Christian, fundamentalist Christian perspective. Well, there's no way to divorce that from the individual nature of Christianity. And so therefore it gets rolled into that. And any politician who is going to accept the support of this grassroots conservative Christian movement is going to get rolled up into that paradigm that conservative Christianity is steeped in, which is that individual moral perspective. And so the Democrats, they don't have that. So they aren't necessarily part of that movement, and they're leaning in the 70s and 80s, leaning much more secular than the GOP is. And so they don't have that albatross around their neck that they have to live up to anything individual. And they are coming from a much more socialistic worldview and perspective, which is entirely collective in its nature. So this goes back to the fundamental framework that these two different ideologies inhabit, or are made up of, composed of. The conservative Republican is composed of a framework of individual morality, whereas the Democratic framework is made up of a perspective that is a collective one, and that the individual has far less value or importance. So if an individual in the collective perspective, collective worldview, isn't everything that he would wish the collective to be, that's all right. That's expected. That is the norm. But if you're coming from the Christian perspective, which is all about the individual by its very nature, and you don't live up to the collective morality, which for a Christian, a collective morality is no more than the sum of all individual morality. Whereas for a Democrat, that's not the case. Collective morality has nothing to do with individual morality. It is what we impose upon the supposed collective group, upon society. So society can be moral from a socialistic standpoint in spite of, and often because of, the immorality of the individual. So a Christian would look at a group morality and would say that a group is immoral, regardless of the group's overall assessment or overall character, if the individuals in the group are immoral themselves. Whereas from a socialistic standpoint, the group could be entirely moral, even if it is born from the bloodshed of immoral leaders, such as we see amongst socialist dictatorships, where you'll have the leaders who are performing and committing atrocious acts of immorality, all with the purpose of achieving a collective good. So Christians don't see it that way. There is no Christian greater good that allows for or even prescribes individual evil. And so this is a traditional distinction between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, between the left and the right more broadly, because in our country, left and right are almost completely overlaps with Republican and Democrat, but in many cases and places that's not the case, where there are many more parties, or these overlaps are not as similar. So the left and the right are broken apart. They are distinguished by this difference in how morality is inhabited by each group. In the right, it is individual, and in the left, it is collective. And that's how it was since the late 70s, at least 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, all the way up until recently. So the gift of Trump, and this is a very objective perspective of this, and it's not necessarily what I approve of. So don't think that I'm advocating for or that I am praising this. But looking at it dispassionately, not through my own personal lens of individual morality, but just trying to look at this through an objective lens of what is and how it is, the gift of Trump to the Republican Party was that he extricated them from that need, that how would I put it, that pressure to live a personal morality that was consistent with and compatible with the collective morality that they preached. And Trump basically did away with that. And so he comes in, and because of him, the Republican Party is now free to engage in and endorse an amoral and a religious, non-religious commitment to traditional values. So the Republicans are now free to be committed to the traditional family values and things like pro-life and abstinence and other issues like this that seem to Christians to be so inextricably tied to individual morality that it would seem incomprehensible to a Republican of the 80s that anybody of Trump's character could be elected, or of the 90s, or of the 2000s when they were going after Clinton for his bad behavior, and astounded that the country was willing to overlook terrible behavior on the part of Bill Clinton. And so the idea that to those, anybody, if you were to ask them, that somebody of Trump's very dubious moral character would be elected predominantly or led by his grassroots movement of evangelical Christians is simply astounding. It's an astounding development. And because of that now, the Republican Party has come out largely unscathed by scandals that would have toppled their leadership in times past. Now, we could think that this is simply the moral ambiguity of the time catching up with the Republican Party in a delayed fashion, that it worked its way through the Democratic Party, and now the country is so morally ambiguous that they have just it just has seeped in and is corrupted the Republican voter finally. Finally, but it's difficult to make that case in my mind because it seems there have almost been a reversal of this. Now, the reversal is that the Democrats now seem to be very susceptible to individual moral shortcomings. Now, their individual moral shortcomings have to be assessed within what is secular morality. And we've discussed this before, that secularists have been, I believe, how would I put this? They have been forced by their own conscience, it's hard to call it. I struggle because all these words don't seem to have a lot of meaning to a secular movement or a secular group. But let's just use the terminology that Christians understand and comprehend that we're not. It's not being engaged or enacted with any sort of precision to the actual terms, but they're the best terms we have, which is part of the problem of the whole issue. So the secularists have had imposed upon them by their own secular conscience a necessity for a secular morality, and that secular morality is, we could call it wokeness, is what it would be called today. So wokeness has become the secular morality. And so any politician who violates wokeness on an individual level is now subject to the same type of condemnation and removal that Republicans used to be subject to for their own personal, traditional moral shortcomings. So when a Republican politician came out and spoke of a collective morality, say of homosexuality or of adultery or of traditional family values, and then it came to find out that he had a shortcoming in his life, even long ago, then that would cost them dearly. So when George W. Bush runs as a born-again Christian, and he has all this support from the Christian community, from the evangelical community, and then right before, on the eve of the election, they drop the surprise that when he was a young man, long ago, he got pulled over and cited for driving under the influence. And most experts believe that he lost the popular vote because of that revelation. And this is by people who knew that he was an alcoholic when he was younger. And this is him admitting openly for a very long time that he had been an alcoholic and that he had gotten saved and that had changed his life. And yet, the idea that there was a moral individual shortcoming in his life nearly cost him the election. Republicans, these weren't Democrats who all of a sudden decided not to vote for him. These were Republicans, Christians, who decided not to vote for him because they didn't want to have somebody who, when he was 20 years old, had gotten a DWI, or however old he was. I forget his actual age, but I think it was around in his 20s when he'd gotten a DWI. This was after Clinton. And so the idea that this immorality or this moral ambiguity had seeped into the Republican electorate, that's not what really happened. They were still committed to the individual morality. Now, contrast that with the recent developments going back a year or 2 years of all the leftist icons who have been dethroned, have been charged, have been their careers ruined, destroyed because they broke some law, woke law, some secular morality law. They broke the law, and they have been now capsized, have been completely undone in their political aspirations. This is not something that we saw much of before. So this is a very new development. So what we have is not, in my mind, what we have is not that the Republican Party has slowly become secular in that sense. Rather, it seems that Trump has he has brought into the Republican Party a certain ability to overlook individual shortcomings and not take them seriously, so long as they are publicly, collectively doing the right thing. So Christians now find themselves defending Trump, often calling him godly and God-fearing, of which I find little evidence of either. Because in his public performance, he is strongly engaged in the collective morality. So I think that Trump might have ended up doing more for the cause of abolishing abortion than any president we've ever had, which is very interesting because I'm not convinced that Trump has any particular personal morality on this issue. I think that his opposition to abortion, first off, it's very late coming. We know by his own statements that he was not pro-life for a long period of time. And so maybe he had a dramatic change of mind, and maybe he is really pro-life to his very core in a very moral, individual moral sense. I highly doubt that. I think that he knows that that is the collective moral compass and that he's pursuing that as a politician without any particular individual commitment to it. And I don't know that Christians would be all that worried or bothered if they came to find out that he had had some affair at some point and that the woman with whom he had an affair had gotten an abortion. Now, I'm not saying that has happened. I'm not making any allegations. This is a completely hypothetical situation. But I don't find any evidence that Christians would be so appalled by that they wouldn't vote for him. I mean, think of all the, frankly, quite appalling, not even accusations, facts, recordings in his own voice, things that people know for a fact he said and did that have come out about him, and it doesn't seem to bother the evangelical base hardly at all. I know some of you were quite taken aback when certain recordings came out that had Trump speaking in a very filthy, disgusting way, and Christians were appalled by that. And yet I find that, or we all do, that it's incredibly the majority of his supporters, or the majority of conservative Christians supporting as strongly as they supported Bush, who was, for all we could tell, for all has ever come out, a very decent fella, at least at the time he ran for office. And so this is the gift that Trump has given to the Republican Party. And the woke movement has given the Democrat Party a certain curse, and that now they're being held to a standard they've never been held to before. And so this has caused quite a political upheaval in the country. I find that there is a certain parallel that we can draw from this situation all the way back into Lincoln's very how would I put it, his de facto leadership of the abolitionist movement. So if you listen to Christian histories, you would think that Lincoln was this rock-solid, moralist, anti-abortionist, and that he spent hours and hours on his knees praying that God would destroy slavery. But that's not at all what Lincoln was at any point in time, especially not at the beginning. So Lincoln opposed slavery from a purely economical standpoint at the beginning, is from what we can tell. I mean, the evidence is that while he may have found it somewhat distasteful, his real opposition at the beginning was an economical one, and he was very moderate in how he wanted slavery to be handled. In fact, he was willing, at least according to his statements, he was willing to leave slavery intact, provided that there was some solution found in which it would not encroach into the economical strong powerhouse that was the North. Because slavery threatened to destroy the northern economy, which was based on the middle class. It was based on the northern economy was based on the idea that you could sell your labor. And you didn't have to own a farm or a plantation. You didn't have to own a factory. You didn't have to own a business. You could go work for somebody and sell your labor. Well, slavery destroys that principle. That it destroys that ability. And so Lincoln's original position seems to be one entirely economical. Now, I think that over time he moved towards a more moral opposition to slavery itself and its evils. At least it seems that way. But it's hard to tell because Lincoln was a master politician and he knew how to craft a message that would sell something, even if he was selling the substance of abolition. And we're not exactly sure if he was firmly convinced or persuaded of the package that he was putting that in. He may have been, and I'm not trying to taint his character or his legacy. But so when we look at that and we look at how Lincoln was not necessarily the moral leader of abolitionism, but rather the political leader, well, that's what we have in Trump. In Trump, we have someone who has become the political leader of traditional moral values, which is very, very interesting, very incredible. And we have the left, who is now being saddled with the individual responsibility that they have been largely able to get out of. They've been able to slip through for a long time, and now they're not. And we see this, for instance, in this current scandal, the recent scandal that is kind of surrounding Biden. So you have a woman now accusing Joe Biden of sexually harassing or sexually assaulting. Her accusation is that he sexually assaulted her, 30 years ago. And these are the type of accusations that I think would have been shrugged off. In fact, these are the accusations that have been basically shrugged off with President Trump. Similar accusations. You can argue and get technical as to who has the worst ones, or which ones were the most credible, or whatever you want. But these type of accusations, or some form of them, have been shrugged off of the president, and yet they are seriously hurting the Democratic nominee for the future, for the upcoming election. And so this is a very, very interesting to me how this is playing out. Now, the question I have, or what I think we have to consider, is if this reversal of moral fortune is true, and this is really happening, the question is, how do we as Christians respond to that? How do we assess that? How do we weigh that? How do we put that into any type of Christian perspective? That is a very difficult, very complicated question that I'm not sure I know how to answer. For instance, do we, as Christians, is it right for us to vote for somebody with dubious moral character, with proven moral shortcomings, who not that long ago has said terrible things that Christians cannot approve of? What if Donald Trump was to run against somebody who was morally upright, say a Jimmy Carter, who, as far as anyone can tell, is in the sense of traditional moral values, is quite upstanding. Not even if we were to take into account his very woke attitude or viewpoints on things like homosexuality of late. But for everything anyone can see, Jimmy Carter, very upstanding individual. What if he's running? What if Donald Trump what if the Democrats were to put up a candidate with that type of moral integrity running against Donald Trump? That would be a very difficult decision for many Christians to make. Because on the one hand, you know that the Democratic platform is pro-abortion. And Donald Trump has a proven history of getting judges into the courts, and especially the Supreme Court, who most likely are strongly pro-life. And one more justice, say Ginsburg, retires, and Donald Trump is president and is able to get one more of that caliber of justice onto the Supreme Court, we're looking at the reversal of Roe v. Wade. Very, very likely. So this is the dilemma that Democrats have faced for a very long time. In fact, that's the one that they are facing right now. So they have put all their eggs in the woke basket. And the woke doctrine is that if you transgress one of these secular sins, there's no forgiveness for you. And so if you are accused of accosting a woman, of abusing a woman, of assaulting a woman, of making a woman feel sexually uncomfortable, even inadvertently, then you are done with. You are canceled. But now here they have what, at least at the beginning, appeared to be a very credible accusation against the former vice president. Now, if you've done any research and kept up with this story beyond the opinion pieces that you can read or listen to on television, and actually kept abreast of the facts as they have been developing, then you'll know that these accusations are starting to look a little shaky. They're starting to look a little suspicious. And that's why those Christians that weren't quick to jump on this story and start crowing about it were very wise. And I hope you're one of them, because you need to realize that there are crazy people all over the place. There are misguided people all over. There are unbalanced people, unhinged people all over. There are lying people all over. So we can't just accept an accusation against somebody because it happens to further our political views or our political goals. But going back to this, so now Joe Biden has this strong accusation made against him. It's seems to be starting to gather steam, and some of the leaders of the woke movement, the Me Too movement and Time's Up movement, and these different ones who had been putting out the battle cry of believe all women, are now walking that back and offering Joe Biden their absolution, their redemption, telling the accuser that even though they do believe her, that beating Trump is more important. Now, this may seem appalling to you and me, this attitude, this hypocrisy, this blatant hypocrisy. But this is the Democratic modus of operandi, standard operating procedure, forever. They've always been this way. They gave Bill Clinton a pass, not because they actually believed he didn't do it. Everybody knew he did it. And not because as many people thought, because they themselves felt then they were justified in their own immorality. That's not why. It was for political expediency. Bill Clinton was going to push the policies they wanted, even policies that were antithetical to his own moral shortcomings. So he would push hypocritical things like traditional family values. He would push that. Bill Clinton was one of those types of conservative Democrats who were pushing for traditional family values, talking about the family. Everybody knew that he didn't live it. It didn't matter. He was their guy. He had their backs. He was going to push the collective value. And so they stood behind him. And that's what the call is by people like Bill Maher and the Me Too leaders and these other people who have in the past said that we can't allow not one of these predatory men to get away. Well, now, lo and behold, who would have guessed Handsy Joe might have done something that for the woke theology is unpardonable. Well, now they're offering him a pardon. And it'll be interesting to see if that pardon takes or if he becomes another casualty in this newfound democratic individual morality. Meanwhile, on the Republican side, Trump could, in his own words, shoot somebody dead out in the street and they would still vote for him. He could go on tape talking locker room filth and they'll still vote for him. Now, I'm not accusing anybody for voting for him. I'm not trying to reprimand anybody for voting for him. I voted for him. So what I am trying to tell you is that we need to realize that there is a very complex shift happening before our eyes. This is more than just that Republicans have had moral ambiguity seeping in to their collective consciousness. I think it's far more than that. I think that in some way, somehow, Trump came and gave the Republicans the gift of moral ambiguity, individual moral ambiguity. We are now willing to tolerate, we are now willing to embrace flawed moral leaders. And when the left calls upon our sincerity and our integrity as Christians to immolate politicians who have more individual moral shortcomings, we have been, and I say we because there's anyone who has voted for him or is willing to vote for him to become, in 2020, you have to include yourself in that, even if you don't like it, as distasteful as it is. We have basically said, no, we are now past that. We are now taking up the democratic mantle that the ends justify the means. And so if we can accomplish collective moral good on the back of a immoral individual, then we are essentially okay with that. So that's something that every one of us is going to have to consider, because that is what you're saying. If you vote for Trump, you are embracing this exchange between Democrats and Republicans. And Democrats are becoming, and in some ways have already become, the party of individual morality. Now, I know you're going to bristle against that because you're going to point at abortion and homosexuality and gay marriage and say that's not morality. But I'm not talking about, I'm using morality as a very generic word in which it applies to two very different sets of values between the two parties. So when we talk about morality amongst Republicans, we're talking about traditional morality, Judeo-Christian morality. When we talk about morality or use the word morality in connection with the Democratic Party, now we're talking about secular morality. We're talking about wokeness. And when we look at it just as a container word in which each party can put their own values, the left and the right can put their own values into this container word, then we realize that the entire paradigm of morality in the parties has been flipped upside down, which is very, very interesting to me. Anyways, so that was what I was looking at today and thinking about as I read some of the news articles that are coming out and some of the information that you can get a hold of. And I thought that would be something that would be, I think, is important for each of us to consider as we go into elections, and what, as Christians, should be our response to this. And I'm not real sure what our response should be. Maybe you know, but I'm not real sure. Do we vote for somebody who has terrible individual moral shortcomings? Do we accept that's the case, but he's going to be perhaps the greatest champion of the collective traditional moral worldview? Maybe so. But we also shouldn't be lying to ourselves about this. We shouldn't be deceiving ourselves about this. We shouldn't be pretending that Donald Trump is a stalwart, is a bastion of individual moral virtue, because he certainly is not. And Christians pretending that's the case, I think, are doing terrible harm to Christianity. I think Christianity can withstand Christians voting, holding their nose and voting for someone who is individually morally flawed, but that, especially now in Donald Trump, we find will probably, has a strong history of collective moral superiority, moral strength. But what is damaging to Christianity is when Christians pretend that's not the case, and they want to maintain that position they had as individual moralists while taking advantage of the political expediency of having somebody in the office who doesn't seem to have much individual morality. I think we need to be honest with ourselves and honest with the world, because that is the gift that Donald Trump has given you, whether you appreciate it or not. Anyways, this might be the last one I'll be able to do for a while. That's why I went ahead and did 2 in a row. But it was great talking to you. And remember, this Saturday at 9 a.m., we will be on with the normal full-length podcast with Brett Carpenter, speaking about a whole number of subjects, including science and creationism. So you guys have a great night, and I will speak to you later.